Good evening to everybody joining us in Asia, and good morning and good afternoon if you are in the Americas and Europe, Africa and the Middle East. I do hope you're all very well and, of course, most importantly, safe. Let me extend a very warm welcome indeed to this, the third in our Blue Recovery series, which is part of the Economist Group's World Ocean Initiative and World Ocean Summit. And of course, just a brief reminder from me and from the Economist events of our next World Ocean Summit and Expo, which is in Lisbon, Portugal, in March 2021. Of course, should all of the stars be aligned by then. For now, though, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. My name is Charlie Goddard. I'm the editorial director at the Economist Group, and I'm also overseeing our initiative on the ocean. For those of us that were with us in the first session in the Blue Recovery series, we explored, if you recall, and for those of you who didn't, just let me update you, we explored the call for building ocean economies back bluer and more sustainably in the wake of, obviously, what is an extraordinary set of economic circumstances presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. In the second session, which happened last week, speakers reflected on the important role of science and innovation, particularly and including financial innovation in the Blue Recovery, and in the transition, and of course in the transition, the longer-term transition to a sustainable ocean economy. We heard, among other things, of exciting moves in Vietnam to scale offshore renewable energy, wind energy, and from Japan, of a new biofuel from sea algae. Lots of interesting things happening there, and also interesting things happening in the financial innovation space as well. In this, the third session in the series, we ask what the delayed ocean super year, what of the delayed ocean super year, now of course much of that super year has been pushed into 2021, what that means for progress around some of the critical ocean issues. Delays aside, for example, has there been a material impact on negotiations at the WTO to remove harmful fisheries subsidies? What about final negotiations on the Treaty on Biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction? Does pushing back the 2020 deadlines throw SDG 14 or further off track? What has been achieved, actually, in 2020 despite the pandemic? And what of the other much anticipated ocean initiatives, such as the UN Ocean Conference and the culmination of the work of the high-level panel on the sustainable ocean economy? All of these things, I hope, will be part of this discussion. We'll ask, too, I think, importantly, about whether the pandemic has put in jeopardy wider international efforts to tackle climate change, to tackle biodiversity loss, or has the pause paradoxically thrown us a bit of a lifeline around some of those things? We talk about the green and the blue recovery. Is that a lifeline that we've been thrown? Are we going to be able to take that? Each of these anthropogenic threats, these crises to the ocean, to climate, to soils, to water, to biodiversity, even, of course, the pandemic, the causes of the pandemic themselves are treated in the international global public policy communities, at least treated separately, but each, of course, are profoundly linked. And so I hope we can finally end up by just asking one or two questions about whether or not our relationship, our very relationship with nature, is at stake. And has the pandemic made it more difficult for us to turn that very important corner that we need to turn, particularly over the course of the next 10 years. So before we move into our first panel, let me recognize and thank very warmly the Nippon Foundation and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for supporting this series. Their long-term vision, and they really do have a long-term vision for a healthy ocean, I think continues to be an inspiration. So let me, in lieu of that, ask the president of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the president, concurrently the president of the Ocean Policy Research Institute, Atsushi Tsunami, to make a few opening remarks. Atsushi, if I can hand over to you.
Hi, thank you, Charles. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and good morning to you all. For those who are with us at the previous webinars, welcome back. I wish to extend my warm welcome to you at this Economist World Ocean Summit inside our third webinar, the Blue Recovery and the Delayed Ocean Super Year that we jointly organized with the Nippon Foundation and the Economist Group. So I may be getting familiar with you through the previous webinars. Once again, I'm Tsushi Tsunami, President of Sasakawa Peace Foundation, as well as the President of the Ocean Policy Research Institute. I'd just like to make a brief opening and welcome remarks. We had the first webinar on the Japan's Marine Day, which was 23rd of July, and the second webinar last week. Last week, we had a Japanese Environment Minister, Shinjiro Koizumi, who has sort of expressed his determination to demonstrate a leadership role on ocean and climate change. So in the subsequent high-level panel discussions, we had very diverse speakers from Seabed to 2030, Indonesian Minister of Marine Affairs and Fisheries, Rev Ocean of Norway, Asian Development Bank, Ukraine, and Main Stream Renewable Power, and discuss the strategies for engaging stakeholders and promoting an integrated approach to advanced science, innovation, finance for a blue recovery and sustainable ocean. So today, bearing in mind the discussion that we had at the previous two webinars, we will discuss the key elements and strategies for addressing the agenda foreseen for the forthcoming major ocean conferences. We are particularly privileged to have key persons in such a process today, namely Japanese Ocean Minister Seiji Eto and Portuguese Maritime Minister Ricardo Santos, and Ambassador Peter Thomson, of course, the United Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean. Minister Eto oversees Japan's ocean policy and international cooperation. Minister Santos and Ambassador Thomson spearheads the preparation for the second UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon next year. Ambassador Thomson directs the work of the high-level panel for the sustainable ocean economy, or the Ocean Panel as a member, and the Friends of the Ocean Actions as a co-chair, with which our OPRI is support as a member of the advisory network for the Ocean Panel as a partner. The year 2020 was supposed to be a super year for the ocean. The Economist World Ocean Summit was supposed to take place in Tokyo last March, and our Ocean Policy Research Institute was supposed to host the related meetings, but they were all canceled, unfortunately. Therefore, a series of important ocean-related meetings were also postponed, such as our Ocean Conference in Palau, the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon, and other international processes, such as the negotiations on the Agreement for Marine Biodiversity beyond the national jurisdiction that we call BBNJ, the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Conference of the Parties to the United Framework Convention on Climate Change. Against these backdrops, it is great to have Singaporean Ocean Ambassador Rena Lee, who is president of the BBNJ Intergovernmental Conference, to shed light on the future perspectives of the BBNJ negotiations. It is also great to have Ambassador Olai Rudon Palau, my good friend, who will tell us the key features of the forthcoming Our Ocean Conference scheduled to be held in Palau this September, that we support together with the Nippon Foundation. And I'm also grateful that Mr. Tiago, of course, Kunha, CEO of the Ocean Azul Foundation, which is like our brother foundation in Portugal, has joined us to share the thrust of stakeholders' discussions for the World Ocean Summit and UN Ocean Conference to be held in Lisbon next year. I also thank Professor Naoko Ishii, to be with us. She's well known, of course, as a former CEO of the Global Environmental Facility, who assumed a new position recently as a director for the Center for the Global Commons at University of Tokyo this month. And we are, of course, very happy to have her back to Japan. So she'll tell us her perspectives for the advancing international collaboration and partnership towards making progress and achievements on the actions for a sustainable ocean, climate, and biodiversity. So I'm certain that we'll have a vibrant discussion throughout today's webinar, and all the speakers will give impetus to our work processes and partnership that we aim to setting the important trajectories for policies towards achieving a sustainable ocean and promoting the blue economy. So I look forward to listening to you all and participating in today's discussion. Once again, thank you for joining us, and I hope that all will enjoy today's seminar, webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Atsushi. It's wonderful to have somebody helping me with my moderation tasks. Thank you for those wonderful introductions. Let's get straight into this. We've got, as I said, these two sessions. We'll start with the ministerial discussion right away. Let me introduce our distinguished speakers. Seiichi Eto, as Atsushi was saying, Minister for Ocean Policy in Japan. Ricardo Santos, who is the Minister of Maritime Affairs in Portugal. He is waylaid at the moment in an assembly meeting and will join us as soon as he can, I think in about 15 minutes. And of course, Peter Thomson, the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean. Let me turn first to Seiichi Eto, if I can, Minister for Ocean Policy in Japan. Thank you very much, Minister, for joining us today. The Minister is going to make some opening introductory remarks on Japan's ocean policy. Can I give the floor to you, Minister? Thank you.
海洋政策担当大臣江藤誠一です。まず本日はこのような機会をいただき、日本財団、笹川平和財団海洋政策研究所、エコノミスト社に感謝申し上げます。我が国は四面環海の海洋国家です。国土面積は約38万平方キロメートルと世界第61位ながら、所管海域はその12倍の約447万平方キロメートル、世界第6位の面積を有しています。我が国の海洋に関する施策も海と同じく広大です。海洋政策担当大臣としては、かかる多種多様な施策を相互に連携、調整しながら政府全体として推進する責務を負っています。海洋をめぐる状況についてですね、海は古来より他国との交易路、また食料を得る場として我々にさまざまな恩恵をもたらしてきました。経済社会、国民生活を支えるという海の重要性はいつの時代も不変です。その一方、海洋をめぐる状況は常に新たな課題とともに変化しています。安全保障上の課題や漁業資源の課題、さらには海洋プラスチックゴミ問題に代表される海洋環境もあります。そうした課題に対応するために、例えば最近の漁業はこれまでの採取する漁業から養殖を含む育てる漁業、資源管理型漁業へと大きく変化しています。安全保障に関しては我が国の周辺海域を取り巻く安全保障環境は日々厳しさを増しています。海によって国境や EEZ を接する国同士が海をめぐって周辺国との摩擦が起きることもあります。海洋国家として各国と連携を緊密にし、力ではなく法の支配に基づく自由で開かれた海洋秩序を維持・強化していく決意です。また我が国は主要資源・原材料のほとんどを輸入に依存する上、その貿易量の 99.6% を海上輸送が占め、 シーレーンの安定的な利用は極めて重要です。加えて昨今の新型コロナウイルス感染症の拡大により、国民生活が大きな危機に直面し、海上物流の必要性を強く認識したところです。我が国は2007年に海洋基本法を制定し、同法に基づき、内閣総理大臣本部長とし、すべての閣僚構成員とする総合海洋政策本部を設置しました。また、海洋施策を推進させる指針として、海洋基本法を策定し、おおむね5年ごとに改定しています。2018年に閣議決定した第3期海洋基本計画は、我が国が引き続き海洋国家として発展していくため、新たな海洋立国への挑戦を掲げています。新型コロナウイルス感染症により日本のみならず世界全体が経済的に疲弊しています。そうした中、海に着目し、海洋を基盤とする経済によってこの困難から再生しようとする国際的なブルーリカバリー推進の動きに日本の海洋大臣として賛同します。ブルーリカバリーにもつながる政策として海洋の産業利用の促進と科学的知見の充実をさらに強く進めていくことが重要です。まず海洋の産業利用の促進に関してですが、我が国として特に海洋資源の利活用に重点的に取り組んでいく考えです。我が国は今では資源の多くを海外に依存しますが、200、300年前の江戸時代には佐渡金山、世界遺産の石見銀山に代表される世界でも有数の金銀の産出国でした。当時の世界経済も大きな影響を与えました。小さな島国が資源国足り得たのは、実は海底を含む地殻変動との関係が深いのです。海底は今も資源の宝庫であります。昨年4月には南鳥島南方の我が国の EEZ 内においてコバルトリッチクラストの掘削性能確認試験に世界で初めて成功しました。また我が国の戦略的イノベーション創造プログラムの中ではレアアースの産出から事業化までを目指しています。引き続き海底に依存する海洋鉱物資源の調査や洋上に引き上げる技術開発等に野心的に取り組んでいきます。また海洋の産業利用を進める上では環境への配慮も不可欠です。温室効果ガスを排出しないゼロエミッション線について我が国として2028年までの商業運航を目標とし、官民を挙げた開発に取り組んでいるところです。科学的知見の充実については、ソーサエティ 5.0 の実現に向けた研究開発の推進が重要です。海洋分野では、データ連携が一つのキーワードとなります。我が国の海洋状況把握体制の確立のため、海洋情報の利用の基盤となる海洋状況表示システムの整備、その機能強化を図っています。海洋と宇宙の連携も大きなテーマとなるでしょう。こうした海洋分野の取り組みを通じて、ソーサエティ 5.0 の実現や我が国のブルーリカバリーの実現に貢献していきます。そしてそれがポスターコロナの海洋国家日本の発展、さらには世界全体の持続可能な海洋の実現につながると信じ、国際社会とも連携を進めていく所存です。ご清聴ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much, Minister. I was just listening to the last part of the conversation, the translation there. There is clearly, as part of the economic recovery in Japan, there's an intense focus on the industrial use of the ocean. as you were just pointing out. And you also mentioned that there were some environmental considerations as well in promoting the long-term sustainability of the ocean. Can I just ask, what is the role of the ocean sector in the recovery, but particularly what are there plans to build back blue and build sustainably in the ocean?
我が国の海事産業については、新型コロナウイルス感染症により世界経済が甚大な影響を受ける中で、我が国の国民生活及び経済活動を支える物流、とりわけエネルギー資源をはじめとする我が国主要資源と物資のほぼ全量を運ぶ海上輸送が経済安全保障に果たす役割の重要性を改めて認識しているところであります。短期的には厳しい経営環境の対応も必要ですが、デジタル化時代に対応した産業構造への転換や、先ほど述べましたゼロエミッション船や自動運航船の開発、実用化等の技術開発を通じて競争力の再構築を図っていくことが中長期的な産業の存続、成長には極めて重要であると考えています。
Oh, I do apologize, Minister. I was on mute. It's my problem. Can I just ask that again? President Ramengasao did talk in the first webinar about Japan's support for our ocean conference in Palau, which was postponed from this summer to early December. What are your expectations for that summit, and indeed, what are your expectations for the UN Ocean Summit that comes in 2021? Are you hopeful that the SDG 14 will be able to move forward then?
本年12月にパラオで開催されるアワーオーシャン会合の成功をお祈りしています。自主的なコミットメントも含めて我が国も積極的に貢献していきたいと考えています。また来年に延期されたポルトガルで開催予定の国連海洋会議では、同国とケニアが共催国としてイニシアティブを発揮していると承知しています。その準備会合では、本日出席のウルドン・パラオ国連常駐代表が共同議長を務められました。コロナ危機を乗り越えるためには、こうした会合で機運を醸成し、海洋の力を持続可能な形で最大限利用することが重要です。ポストコロナを議論する上で、アワーオーシャン会合および国連海洋会議の開催は時機を得たものであります。開催に向けたすべての関係者の尽力に敬意を表します。また、それらの会合に資するため、現在、ノルウェーが立ち上げた持続可能な海洋経済の構築に向けたハイレベルパネルのメンバーである14カ国の首脳による文書が策定中であると承知しています。日本を含め、本日出席しているパラオ、ポルトガルの首脳もメンバーです。この文書がアワーオーシャン会合や、国連海洋会議といった海洋関係のビッグイベントを盛り立っていくものになると期待をいたしています。
Sorry, I'm terribly sorry. I'm forgetting to unmute myself. I do apologize. Let me start again. Let me introduce Ricardo Santos, Minister of Maritime Affairs in Portugal. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've just come in from an assembly meeting and you're taking the time to do this today. Thank you so much. Minister, we reflected just then on Japan's approach to the recovery and to the blue recovery particularly. I wonder if you just tell us first briefly about Portugal's focus around the blue economy and ocean sustainability priorities now that we're in the middle of this pandemic crisis and how they've been impacted by COVID-19. Minister. I wonder if we have the minister there. We don't seem to have him. He's probably having the same problem as I am of unmuting. Minister, would you be able to unmute your microphone? We'll come back, I think, to the minister if we can. It looks like his screen is frozen at the moment and he's not able to unmute.
I'm okay now.
Okay, excellent, Minister.
Well, off and on again.
Excellent. Okay. I'm having the same problem myself.
But it's just recent. I don't know if you said anything else for me.
I was just asking, Minister, if you could reflect on the challenges that Portugal has faced. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure for me to be here. And this is, yes, it's a new normal. It's very different. And you know, I just want to give a picture what the effort has been made and how we were struck by this pandemic. And for that, I would like to begin to tell that the Portuguese economy was generating, and that's the number we have in 2018, a gross added value of more than 3.3 billion euros, which represents 3.5% of national gross value added. And the employment of jobs represented in blue economy 31% of the total of jobs. In fact, in terms of sectors, coastal tourism and recreational activities represented 70 to 72% of the blue economy, respectively, both in terms of VAB and jobs. Culture and transformation industry occupies the second place with 18 to 23%, respectively, in terms of gross value added and jobs. And that is the background. The COVID-19 pandemic that struck the world in 2020 was, and it is not, only a health crisis. It brought with her negative impacts and strong impacts in the Portuguese economy in general, and of course the blue economy is not an exception. And since its big part is tourism, especially coastal tourism, is of major relevance in Portugal, as I think demonstrated by this percentage and this number. It was deeply hurt due to the interruption of flights and the confinement of peoples all around the world in all countries. This was strongly reflected on what we call the HoReCa sector, that includes the hotels and restaurants and the commerce, including exports of sea products. And since the blue economy sector is dominated by this coastal tourism, where the hotels and restaurants has a major relevance, and by fishing and fishing processing sector, the blue economy has suffered strongly, both in terms of employment and monetary value. The numbers are still to be calculated. Of course, we all know that we had major plans for international conferences, debates, and specials planned to Portugal, and all have to be postponed. Just to mention two of them, the United Nations Ocean Conference and the decadal meeting of OSPAR ministers were not took place this year. With the 2020 super year of the ocean was, of course, adjourned for later. And this happened not only in Portugal, but all over the world. But, of course, in these situations, we have to give strong attention to social, health, and economic crises that touch all around. And the efforts have to be made, and that were made in terms of protection of the most in need, the elders and the poor. Priorities were given to the national health system and the social security system, while provide food. As such, a main concern of the Portuguese government has been to protect jobs and the well-being and functioning of our coastal communities. And you will excuse me, but I will refer to a set of measures that we taken. We were put in place to protect the health of sea workers and sea communities while trying to keep the economy functioning as much as possible. Fish infrastructures like markets and auctions were adapted in view to remain open and operational in a new state of pandemics. We developed contingency plans to enact respecting health and safety conditions. Extensive testing and protecting equipment, masks, hand gel, and so on, were guaranteed for fishers and other sea works, and we had strict monitoring measures of contaminations. I must say that the fishing community were one of the less strict by COVID. So I think that the contingency plans that we developed in the fisheries communities were good. We had wage compensation funds. We created a wage compensation fund to compensate for the reduction of income due to the reduction of fishing activity proposed in view to adapt offer to demand. The demand was shorter, given the closing of restaurants and hotels, and also to the collapse of tourism. We create specific credit lines to deal with COVID-19, including in the fishing industry, agriculture, and others. Compensation mechanisms were also implemented in maritime tourism, one of the most affected sectors. Fees and taxes were suspended for certain activities as a way to alleviate losses brought by the pandemic, including reduced exports. New rules regarding the minimum wage and layoff conditions were applied to fishermen and compensate pandemic's economic effect. Specific training programs to adapt business to COVID-19 for fishermen and other sea workers are now in place. The Ministry of the Sea launched an extensive online campaign called Feed Those Who Feed You, designed to support seafood systems and local economies, promotion of online selling, and door-to-door delivery were implementing. Reforms of the European Fisheries and Maritime Fund were negotiating, enabling flexibility of some rules to support the fishermen. But we restrained flexibility above 10%, on which concerns the priority that involves control and the regulation on scientific data collection. We have also strengthened the liquidity of companies in the sector with the creation of a 20 million euro debt relief line. We expedited in terms of public funds that were supporting some of the regular activities. We expediting and anticipation of payments under the operational programs, either through the submission of requests against invoice and not receipts, or support when the expenditure is submitted and not validated in 20 working days. In the end, The difference between pre- and post-COVID-19 lies on the importance of priorities. The relevance of developing innovative business models while supporting traditional sectors became even more evident. In the same vein, we understand now that promoting sustainable activities is even more critical than it was before. In terms of policy, our ocean sustainability priorities were not discarded. The new national network of marine protected areas is in its final stage to become law decree. A new law decree that promotes of sustainable fishing and aquaculture practice. And this new law that was published 1 week ago strengthens pluriannual management plans, promotes policies of co-management involving not only public administrations, but fisheries associations, science, non-governmental. We continued the implementation of the new National Maritime Special Planning Mechanism, which aim to support the development of the blue economy, ensuring the preservation of environmental values at sea and the protection of sensitive marine ecosystems. Of course.
Minister, can I just jump in there? I'm going to need to jump in if I can. We're just running a little bit over the time. Just very briefly, can I just ask you quickly about the UN Ocean Conference? Now, obviously, that's been a big impact on your work, on the logistics, indeed the diplomacy that's gone on in the background around that. What has been able to move forward? How have you managed to move that forward despite the pandemic, and what preparations are now underway for that in 2021? Just briefly, if you could.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. Yes, we are planning to postpone to 2021. We keep the drive. We had several through web conference to keep the drive. You have to understand that these last months has mostly to be occupied on the support to the people in the fishermen and the aquaculture, and to support the poor and the elders, and we are attacking social and economic problems with our communities. Of course, we are at the same time preparing the presidency of the European Union by Portugal in 2021, the first semester. But in shortly, we are creating also a new office in my ministry with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Science to support to implement the support to the Decade of Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. We keep the drive. We are communicating also with the government of Kenya to keep the drive, and of course with Peter Thomson, we have been talking several times to keep the United Nations conference in the agenda but beginning of the second semester, since in the first semester Portugal is really occupied with the presidencies of the European Union.
Minister, thank you very much. Let me jump, as you mentioned, Peter, let me jump straight to Peter Thomson, the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean. And Peter, let me throw that straight to you. Obviously, the delays in the Ocean Super Year and in the UN Ocean Conference obviously are regrettable. But what are the material impacts, do you think, of those delays? Are there material impacts?
I'll answer that question, but can I first thank the Economist Group and Nippon Foundation and Sasakawa Peace Foundation for providing this platform. And for me, it's always an opportunity to talk about dwindling biodiversity and declining ocean health and the ever-growing climate crisis, that these three things are not silos, that they're one thing that we are facing together. And you all know the reason that they are, the problem that they are, which is our anthropogenic greenhouse gases. So all other issues pale in comparison, because these three existential factors directly dictate the future security of human existence on planet Earth. If I'd said those words a decade ago, most of the listeners today would think I was being overly alarmist. But that's not the case today. People are aware now. You know, at the Madrid, just think about this. At the Madrid Climate COP last December, the Secretary General of the United Nations, not me on a soapbox in Hyde Park, the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said, we are knowingly destroying the life support systems of this planet. And he based that dire assessment, of course, on the scientifically expert opinion of the IPBES reports and the IPCC reports. We've got nowhere else to go but to the best of our scientists to find out what's happening. So that's where we are in all this. And then just to riff off what was being said earlier about the postponement of the various conferences from 2020, can I say that while it's true that this disruption has occurred because of the pandemic, the conferences are going to all be held as soon as conditions allow. And, you know, we have to gather at them when they occur in real and in virtual format, because we've got to remain committed to this main drive that we have, securing a sustainable way of life on this planet. And in the meantime, we're maintaining the momentum. And as Minister said, Minister Santos said, that the momentum continues towards the conference. We have a committee who works in New York, which is the UN system, but is co-chaired by Portugal and Kenya, and that is doing all the necessary in the building up stage. Meanwhile, through UNDESA and the UN system, we've got this thing called maintaining the momentum, which is just a series of pressure meetings, webinars, etc. Keep that momentum going towards the UN Ocean Conference in Lisbon. And can I say that in the meantime, we've all got work to do, and we are doing it. Let's take, for example, SDG 14.5 on marine protected areas. We're supposed to get to 10% by the end of this year. Well, that is still achievable, and there's a huge amount of work being done on that. Can I say that the CAMLA meeting in October is critical in that regard? And there are many people from countries who are on CAMLA who can influence that. If we get those three big MPAs, we'll probably get SDG 14.5 done during this COVID year. The same can be said for 14.6 about removing harmful trade subsidies, fisheries subsidies at the WTO. This is doable in December at the WTO General Council, and we've put in a huge amount of work this year to try and make that so. And the ambassadors have been negotiating very diligently in Geneva to make that so. So what I'm saying is the momentum is still going, and people should not despair. We have to make sure that not just SDG 14, but all of the environmental sustainable development goals are not set back by this pandemic.
So Peter, let me just come back on that point, and that is that clearly, you know, the SDG progress report earlier in the year looked at SDG 14 and effectively gave it a fairly disappointing scorecard. We've got the opportunity, as you say, potentially to come back around the fishery subsidies by the end of the year, if that does hold, and indeed around SDG 14.5. But, you know, has the pandemic and indeed have other causes meant that the chances of bringing all of SDG 14 in by 2030 have been made more difficult?
There's no doubt that things are made more difficult, but you know, out of crisis, and we know the Greek origin of the word crisis, which is a time to make decisions, is what the word means. We know that out of the pandemic, we have some very heavy decisions to be making about our future. And you have to see it in that light that I started off with, which is that a pandemic is one thing. It's a short-term thing. People are affected, economies are affected. But a climate crisis for a planet, you know, the sort of thing that dinosaurs faced, that is a much, much more important matter than a pandemic. And, you know, I know that sounds callous, but that is the fact. We cannot take our main concentration off the fact that it is our greenhouse gas emissions, man-made, which are the problem here. And anyway, we said that SDG 14 had got not a very good tick, and I agree with that because it was mainly on finance that was assessed. I think that there's good work going on elsewhere, which does meet SDG goals, like controlling illegal fishing and so on. Excellent work being done by FAO and others. But let me just say that the blue-green recovery road, which we are putting out as the right decision to be made in this time when trillions of dollars are being committed in the short to medium term to create jobs and get us back onto firm footings economically. That this should be going into the blue recovery road. Investments like offshore wind, like the greening of shipping, like sustainable aquaculture, provide us food security. This is not wishy-washy stuff. The high-level panel of sustainable ocean economy has shown that you get a 5% yield on those sustainable blue economy investments. That's a very good yield, and they're employment intensive. So, this is the direction that we need to be taking. This is the decision that we need to be making.
Peter, thank you. I just want to ask you one very brief question, if you could reply to it briefly. That is that, we've talked, and indeed the high-level panel report most recently talked about setting a new relationship between humanity and the ocean, and indeed between humanity and nature. But the requirement to do so was, and this is a question I want to ask the next panel as we move into that, one of the requirements of that would be a much more integrated, much more holistic approach to governance in the ocean. And of course, we have the ambassador from the BBNJ speaking very shortly. What is your response to that? How do we get to a more holistic global governance of the ocean?
Very briefly, because I too am looking forward to that panel. You've assembled a great one, and I'll be sitting in on that. Look, it's all about science and innovation. That's the theme of the Ocean Conference in Lisbon next year. Science and innovation. That's what the member states want to hear. So we've got the UN Decade of Ocean Science coming up. We have great faith in that. We have great faith in innovation. I mean, that's the genius of our species. The ability to innovate and to share better is the other side of that genius. Then that's what will get us through. So the decade starts next year. The Decade of Ocean Science, giving us the ocean science we need for the ocean that we want. And why do we want that ocean? Because you can't have a healthy planet without a healthy ocean. I will stay here, Charles, if there are any questions later, but I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panel now.
Lovely. Thank you, Peter, very much indeed. And thank you, too, to Seiichi Eto, Minister for Ocean Policy in Japan, as well as, of course, Ricardo Santos, Minister of Maritime Affairs from Portugal. And thank you all for bearing with me on that, because let's now move to the next session. I'll speak very briefly to each of the panelists, and then we will try and have a discussion, but we'll also be hopefully bringing some questions in from the audience, and we do encourage questions and comments from the audience. And indeed, as Peter will be in the background there, he may be able to answer some of those too. Let me just introduce everybody. First of all, Rena Lee, President of the BBNJ Intergovernmental Conference, as well as being, of course, Ambassador for Oceans and Law of the Sea Issues and a Special Envoy for the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Singapore. Naoka Ishii, Director for the Center for Global Commons, so ably introduced by Atsushi Tsunami earlier, and a professor at the Institute for Future Initiatives at the University of Tokyo, but of course, in her previous iteration, the CEO of the head of the Global Environment Facility. Tiago Pita-Ekuna, who is chairman of the Oceano Azul Foundation, and Atsushi Tsunami, of course, president of the Saskia Peace Foundation. Let's move straight into this. Rena Lee, president of the BBNJ Intergovernmental Council, welcome and thank you very much for joining us today. It's wonderful to have it. Of course, the BBNJ, the UN Treaty on Biodiversity of Areas Beyond National Jurisdiction, the first treaty of its kind on marine biodiversity in the high seas, has also, of course, suffered delays due to the pandemic. And I'm delighted to sort of ask Rena Lee to help us pass out, in a sense, the implications of those delays, if there are any, and where indeed the BBNJ process is at this point. Could I ask you, Rena, to reflect on this? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlie, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I'm very happy to be here. And so first of all, allow me to thank the organizers, the economists, the Nippon Foundation, and the Sasakawa Peace Foundation for inviting me to participate in this webinar. And indeed, Charlie, you were right. The fourth session of the Intergovernmental Conference, which I will shorten to IGC, it's a long mouthful, was scheduled to be held in March this year. But of course, by that time, we saw the pandemic starting to spread. And so, and prior to the pandemic occurring, many delegations had expressed the view that the process could be successfully concluded in 2020. But because of the pandemic, the General Assembly decided to postpone the next session of the IGC to the earliest available date. And that earliest possible available date looks to be happening sometime in 2021. And after consultations with the UN Secretariat, member states, the Bureau, all the relevant stakeholders in the process, we are looking at 2021. At this point in time, I can't pinpoint a date yet. I think none of us have that degree of certainty. But rest assured that I am working to try and pinpoint that date. But it doesn't mean, although the fourth session was delayed, it doesn't mean that all work in the process came to a standstill. You asked me what were the implications of the delay. I think that there were quite a number of member states that choose to see the delay as an opportunity to have a better grasp of the issues, an opportunity to be able to reach out across the table to their partners. I don't know if you've ever been in one of our sessions. It's a very compressed 2-week time frame where you're going from the morning to the night and you're just going on and you have to react very quickly. It has given us is an opportunity to be able to reflect a little bit more deeply on some of the issues and to explore possible options in terms of areas where we can derive convergence. And so, of course, many of the stakeholders in the process, including member states, civil society, intergovernmental organizations, academia, they've also been developing, they've also been conducting informal work, bringing delegations together to continue discussions on the issues so that by the time the fourth session comes around, hopefully we can have clarified some of our doubts. It's given member states the opportunity to consult more deeply within their own governments, within their own systems about some of the issues. Now, apart from these informal efforts, we, as a process, I'm happy to say, and I think by now in fact, all the missions in New York would have received the information. We will be embarking also on intersessional work between now and the end of the year. And this intersessional work is really, as Peter Thomson had said earlier, is aimed at maintaining the momentum in terms of the process and to enhance our understanding of the different issues. And really, this was a point that many delegations had made when I consulted them, when I undertook a series of consultations with delegations, and the additional time gives them really the opportunity to talk It's something, if you speak to others, they will tell you, I always encourage delegations to reach out and talk to others. It's not enough to study the issues yourself. It's important that we go out and we try to understand the different interests, the different points of view, so that we can come to areas of convergence.
So, Rena, thank you. I mean, it's good to know that there is a sort of tentative date or a tentative assumption that it's going to be 2021 when this process resumes. Can I just, I mean, one of the challenges that sits there is this question of whether the draft itself is ambitious enough. And part of the reason for that question is that there are a number of things that are undecided in the draft and left in parentheses, if you want to put it that way, and there aren't decisions around them then. And of course, the process that you're saying now is part of the process of looking at those conditions and understanding how to manage that balance. I think the big question that everybody really wants to ask is this really going to have teeth? Is it going to be something that can be implemented in a way which genuinely protects the high seas? And what balances now need to be struck in order to be able to do that, in order to be able to give this agreement teeth?
So I think that if you speak to those to persons who have been involved in the process from the beginning, from the outset, I've always emphasized that really what I'm hoping we will build is a fair, balanced, and effective treaty. I really just want to build that fair, balanced, and effective treaty. I've really asked delegations to focus on the processes and the people, meaning to say, how will we do what we say we want to do? And who are the actors that will be involved in these processes? Why do I say that? It's because I think it's clear from the discussions that we want the agreement to be a long-lasting agreement. We want the agreement to be able to stand the test of time. And to do that, really the focus is on mechanisms that help, as what you had mentioned earlier, that help move us closer towards a more integrated, a more holistic global governance. And that's why it's also important to identify the actors. And you will see in parts of the draft talking about who are the different stakeholders and who will be involved in the consultation process and who can give their views. That's one aspect of it. We know that we don't know enough about the areas beyond national jurisdiction. We know there is a decade of ocean science, and after the decade, we can anticipate that we will know a lot more than we know now. So really, I think the agreement's not really designed for, is not really designed as something that takes into account just what we know today, but really a process that can absorb the new knowledge, the new information, the new data, and still it works. It still allows us to come to decisions in terms of the deployment of area-based management tools, in terms of how environmental impact assessments are conducted, reviewed, in terms of how we will build capacity, how we can transfer technology. So that's really what the focus is. And when we talk about effective, and this is in relation to the high ambition question, I think really it's a question of balance. One thing that I've said is that because we're talking about the areas beyond national jurisdiction, for the agreement to be effective, it's really important for us to have near universal participation in this agreement. Everybody, as far as possible, must come in.
I mean,
I'm sorry?
Is that really going to be possible, do you think, given that the United States is not a signatory to the UNCLOS, although it's part of the discussions, but how many, very briefly, how many do you expect to be able to come? Because you're absolutely right, if there isn't a large participation, it is going to be very difficult to make it effective, isn't it?
Well, it's my, I can neither predict nor guarantee how many will come on board, but it's certainly my objective to provide the conditions where as many countries as possible will remain actively and constructively engaged in the process. Because in my view, the more involved you are in building this treaty, the more likely you are as a country to join the treaty. So that's my theory of how we're going to do it.
Thank you, Rena, very much indeed. And I thank you for your candid comments there. Let me just move and let me just take those comments and go immediately to Olai Uludong, who I'm embarrassed to say that I didn't, in fact, introduce earlier, but who was, in fact, out and then came back from a special engagement. But Olai Uludong is the ambassador on climate change and permanent representative to the UN in Palau. Can I just ask you, Olai, if you might comment on your perceptions of how the BBNJ process is unfolding, because I know you're part of this set of discussions. Are you confident that it's going to result in an agreement that does protect the ocean, the high seas?
Hi, thank you, Charles, and my apologies. I had to, Palau still and is one of the last remaining countries that is COVID-free. So I had to actually join another event to talk about our ocean conference just for a few minutes, and then I had to run back in. And that's what it is for Palau. Is we're very blessed to be able to do that. So balancing between the online and physical. But thank you so much for allowing me to come back in and join this panel. And on your question on the BBNJ, of course, let me acknowledge Ambassador Rena, who's the president of the BBNJ Treaty. And let me thank her because she pretty much has said in terms of overall what likelihood the treaty will be looking like over the next few months, and of course in the midst of the pandemic. In particular on my role as the co-facilitator on capacity building, and of course in looking at the treaty itself and being aware, as you know, I'm also the UN Ocean Conference that was supposed to be held in Portugal this year and now postponed till next year. That I'm also one of the facilitators, and also with regards to our Ocean Conference, I'm actually home because I am the Secretary General for the Ocean Conference, including the Sherpa for the high-level panel on sustainable ocean economy. So I wanted to respond to your question because it relates to all the 4 areas around the ocean that I'm currently representing Palau and the countries on, is that, yes, I think so. I think with the COVID-19, it's been a very good sort of wake-up call for us to sort of take a step back and look at the situation with regards to delays. So now, as you know, in terms of the BBNJ treaty, we have one last remaining session. And yes, I mean, I heard your question in regards to the US and its involvement on this treaty and not being a member of the UNCLOS in the beginning, and how that factors in. And that, sort of bodes well with the other our ocean and UN ocean. And that, the pandemic actually highlights the part where there are benefits to taking sort of a restocking or a sort of focus on what is needed in this last stretch for the treaty on BBNJ. Because as you know, before the pandemic hit, became a pandemic, we were all saying this is going to be the super year of the ocean. But of course, the pandemic said, okay, no, everybody, everyone, all the countries, and of course, all these conferences has now had to readjust itself to the new normal. So, of course, over the next few months, we are going to trial a virtual forum on exchanging ideas of how to build that better for the treaty. But do I believe that, yes, there will be a treaty that will be robust enough for everyone to be involved in? I do believe there is hope, because the pandemic has showed us that there is hope, and that if the countries are able to sort of reflect on where we ended up, before the pandemic, and sort of come back and say, okay, what are the benefits we've learned from this pause, and that when we do get to that last stage of the BBNJ negotiations, that we are all on the same page.
I think you're quite right in saying that the pandemic has given us a pause for thought, hasn't it? It's quite an important pause for thought. I suppose the question really will be whether we'll take that pause, and do something good out of it. Can I just briefly ask you, before I go on to Naoko Ishii, could I just briefly ask you about the UN, sorry, not the UN, but the Our Ocean Conference? Because, of course, that's not far away now. And I mean, obviously, COVID is still around. How are you expecting that now to unfold, and what are your expectations, briefly, on the outcomes you hope to see from that?
On the Our Ocean Conference, of course, it's similar to how the other conferences are sort of looking ahead in terms of holding them. We are still as a placeholder on December 7 and 8, because we will look at the pandemic and see how we can adjust ourselves. But in terms of the Our Ocean Conference, there's always been, Charles, the physical and virtual element of the Our Ocean Conference. But what makes the Our Ocean Conference works is the commitments. So this is a really good opportune time, because we have launched the commitment registry on July 22. So I really would ask that everyone in all the countries and all the stakeholders and partners, civil society and youth, that if you have the commitments, please look. This is an opportune moment to look at your commitment, and then a good time to go into the registry, of which we've launched online, and it will go all the way until December, and to be able to readjust according to what the situation is regarding COVID-19. So we are still working on that, because what makes the Our Ocean Conference work is the commitment and registry, because it'll be able to tell us about tracking progress. And it's a software that will do it. And in order for it to work, though, the countries and stakeholders have to go in now and then adjust their commitments where they are now. And then in December, the thinking is that, of course, now we have to readjust to look at the pandemic, and maybe a good way to end the year with a boost on where we are at and raising ambition on the 6 thematic areas of which Our Ocean Conference focuses on. So it is still going, because it has that virtual element. The only challenge, of course, is the physical part of it, because that was the part where the magic was, we have that public-private or public-public, triangular, cooperation and announcements that could be done physically. But now that that's sort of in question around the pandemic, we will continue to work on the virtual element, of which the commitment and registry is able to track the progress. And that can be ongoing. That doesn't have any impact, because we're all on virtual platforms. And then as time goes by over the next few weeks or so, we will then look at the structure of the participant and how that involvement would look like as a hybrid. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, from one ocean conference organizer to another, I wish you the very best of success. And of course, anything that we can help do, we will certainly try. And I was certainly myself hoping to come along to that virtually or physically. Naoko Ishii, can I turn to you? It's wonderful to see you again, and lovely to see you in your new role in academia, to have you in your new role in academia, which you've just taken up as director of the Center for Global Commons at the University of Tokyo. I wanted to go back, if I could, to Peter's sort of broad comment about all of these issues are connected. And one can't sort of look at oceans without also looking at climate change, and without also looking at biodiversity. All of these global challenges that are thrown up by the Anthropocene and thrown up in front of us are crises that we need to deal with together. And I know that's very much a part of what you're thinking now is around the Center for the Global Commons. Can I just ask you to help us think about why we need to do that, and how difficult it will be to do that, to put all these together, because we do tend to think of them totally separately.
But, and quite right. And thank you so much for having me. I mean, this discussion is really fascinating. And about this COVID-19, I think that we are a bit of missing point that why we have COVID-19, what is the root cause of COVID-19, and that will help our shaping the future path. I think the science tells us that the fundamental reason of COVID-19 is actually the collision between natural system and human system. We, even for the last 2 decades, we have had several of those the diseases like SARS and MERS and COVID-19, so that it all kind of symptom that our economic and social system actually intervene and destroy the integrity of the ecosystem through our actually agricultural production expansion, and then through deforestation, our urban system settlement is really entering into the natural system. And because of this, nature and the human economic system collides with each other, we do have this kind of disease and for the last 2 decades. So as you mentioned, as maybe Peter mentioned, that actually the COVID-19 is a manifestation of the fact that we are in Anthropocene. From that point of view, climate change, biodiversity loss, the ocean problem, and COVID-19 have the same root cause that our economic and social system are in collision with nature. This means that we have to come up with a fundamental solution to those issues, which is how we can transform our economic or social system so that we can ensure going forward our economic system are on balance, are in harmony with nature, so that how we can transform our production consumption system, how we can transform our food system, how we can make that the smooth transition of the energy, and how we can do the smart cities. And these are all actually the solution to this fundamental problem we do have now. And so from that point of view, this 2000 delay of that super year 2020 to, let's say, 2021, it actually makes a lot of sense because it helps us think through the fundamental root cause and the fundamental solution. And we need to take this time to think it through. And from one part, it's basically acceleration of what we are trying to do at the beginning of 2020. There's a nature-based solution, how to put that in the value of the nature, how to include that into the decision-making system. Either it's nature-based solution or subsidy issue. So that's one. But the second thing which the COVID-19 revealed is actually weakness, vulnerability of our current system. So that it revealed that the weakness of the value chain, supply chain, that it actually signified the importance and the weakness of weakest part of the link, like a smallholder farmers, that the coastal fishermen. So how we could rebuild this value chain toward a much more resilient one, so that it also gives us an opportunity to rethink the vulnerability of the current system. So let us accelerate this and the nature-based solution, how to put the nature in our economic thinking, but how to actually address the weakness the COVID-19 revealed. So from that point of view, we need to seize this important moment to actually think deeper. And then while we are doing that, as you already mentioned, that we need to take a holistic, comprehensive view, because that we tend to think this silo by convention, the silo by planetary boundary, but these are all connected. So it's extremely important for us to have a comprehensive, holistic view, because the root cause of the problem is, in my view, it's same. And then when we do it, as previous speakers already mentioned, we need a multi-stakeholder platform, because it's not just one industry or one government issue. It's really our nature versus our system. So we need a very broad participation or multi-stakeholder platform to deal with this. Then the final point, let's focus on the 2050, not 2030. That strategy to achieve the sustainability 2050 should be very different let's just think about next 10 years. Next 10 years is important to have a better future in 2050. Sometimes we only focus on the 2030, but this next 10 years is critical for 2050. So let's not make that kind of a mistake. So, and that's why we established this Center for Global Commons. Thank you.
Thank you, Naoka, very much indeed. Let me just say to our audience at the moment that we are going to add an extra 10 minutes onto this discussion because we started a little bit late and because we've had one or two glitches. So we will get to Tiago. I have a feeling we may not get, and I hope he doesn't mind, but as the supporter of this program, we may not get to Atsushi before the end of this, but we will focus on these very questions. And I just want to come back to you, Naoka, if I can. As a devil's advocate, really, and just say, look, I think the next 10 years are certainly critical, but there isn't a lot of evidence, it strikes me at least anyway, that we're really building back greener or building back bluer, and there certainly isn't a lot of evidence at the moment that we're trying to put all of this together in a holistic way. And our relationship with nature is still broken, and it's going to take a lot to fix it. So what is the architecture, in a way, of putting all of that together and accelerating it over the course of the next 10 years? I mean, that's a very ambitious thing to do.
No, absolutely. Actually, you already answered the partly to that question. The starting point is that we all have to have a courage to acknowledge that we are off track, that we are off track in achieving the SDG, we were off track in achieving the Paris Agreement. It's sometimes difficult to admit it, but then, and even before COVID-19, we are off track. And then this also means to me that then just trying to do the same thing, that doesn't really solve the problem. And it goes back to your question, what is a really effective governance mechanism? And then actually, to me, working for the GF for 8 years, my answer is that the treaty doesn't really give that the entire solution. But the treaty could be helpful once it's kind of galvanized the multi-stakeholder and put everything towards that joint goal. But then the treaty on themselves don't really provide any effective solution. And that's why I think, as several speakers mentioned, it's a multi-stakeholder platform is important. But then the reason that I established, or actually Tokyo University established the Center for Global Commons is, first let's acknowledge the current system doesn't really give us a good solution, an effective mechanism. Then we really try to do several things. That one of the mechanism we try to come up with is a kind of index of guiding post that which country, which company actually that are doing a good job to contribute to the global commons, and then the which country or company are actually that undermining it. And once we were able to come up with those kind of guiding posts, that the index, that then, and if we can rank it and publish it, does it really provide a good the policy discussion? And hopefully that's kind of science-based targets and the publishment of those targets may actually steer the investment that towards those in a good company or a good country. That is maybe one mechanism we are trying to set up. Thank you.
Thank you, Naoka. And let me take what you've been saying, if I can, and just bring Tiago in, because I know Tiago Cunha, who's chairman of the Oceano Azul Foundation, has been thinking very deeply about these issues as well. I mean, Tiago, you're fond of saying, when we've spoken at least anyway, that the ocean is not one of the carriages that make up the train. In a way, you're actually saying the same thing, that somehow we aren't thinking about all of these things properly. Can you just tell us a little bit about why we need to rethink what we're doing and what it is that we need to do so?
Well, thank you very much, Charles, and my greetings to you and to my friend and colleague Atsushi Tsunami from the Sasakawa Peace Foundation. We look forward of this alignment of stars for March in Lisbon for the Ocean Summit, and we will welcome everyone in Lisbon and support everyone as it needs to be. I also would like, of course, to greet also Ambassador Peter Thomson, not only because he's representative of the Secretary General, but because he's also a champion for civil society, for ocean civil society, and we are part of that civil society. But I tend to agree a lot with what was just said. We are still probably, we did great progress in the last 5 years on environmental awareness. The Paris Agreement of 15 was a change. The UN Oceans Conference in what concerns oceans in 17 was also an important event. Plastics, ocean pollution from plastics spread from there. So people are more aware now, but in real terms, I think that the ocean environmental crisis is not fully understood or perceived yet by our species. Even scientists, I am deeply worried with this report of the IUCN on deoxygenation. I think that not even available science understands fully the extent of this crisis. At the same time, of course, we have all these reports, including the IPCC reports, that we have a decade not to make unviable a viable climate at the end of the century. So I agree with what Ambassador Peter Thomson said, that we have to remain focused on this existential threat. And in relation to such a threat, I think that in terms of action by the international community, we are still in prehistoric times because we've been not indeed taking the bold, fair actions that needed to be taken. And 2020, as everyone said, was a lost opportunity because of the pandemics. So I think that in a way, it can be, we should be very careful when we try to postpone our expectations and ambitions from 2020 to 2021, because we run the risk of being disappointed. And I find that disappointment at this moment can be dangerous for that civil society that is demanding more of us, especially the youth, I have to say. The youth has been put on brackets because they were also victims of the pandemic and they've been at home. But when they'll come back to the streets, they will come stronger, and I'm afraid they will probably even be more angry. And so this is something that I think we have to deal with. And I finish now by saying that we need to push all in this direction of more action, and this action needs to have a strong signal by the international community, by the United Nations membership. The BBNJ is an example of how complex it is to come to such an agreement, and indeed we need other agreements to come to the fore. We need to go to pollution problems. We need to move into reduce significantly nutrient, sediment, plastic and chemical pollution of our waters. So I will stop here so that I don't go a lot about the time, and I hope I'll be able to also speak on a number of initiatives that can push in that direction.
Well, let me just follow that up, Tiago, just by asking you. I mean, obviously you've started this Rise Up movement, the Blue Call to Action for the Ocean, which is a group of a large group now of NGOs, of citizens groups, of you hope businesses and governments engaged too. But the focus of your work is trying to bring business and government into this broader discussion. And of course that belies your own skepticism about the fact that they're not in this process at the moment. Are there any signs, do you think, that are there good signs that businesses and governments are now really beginning to think differently about the way in which they look at the ocean?
I think so. As I said, in the last 5 years, there has been a huge change. I think that if we would go back to 2014, we would be in a much worse situation. Governments, I think that at least in their public speeches, are understanding the situation of climate change. They are now trying to push for climate action at the national level, for instance. Business also, I think that especially big business is understanding as well that we are coming to a point in which the environmental unsustainability is becoming a cause for future financial and economic problems. And so that's probably causing a change as well. I think that, for instance, Davos this year was considerably focused on all these environmental change, climate change problems, and also to a certain extent on oceans already. The rise up, exactly, Charles, was because of this UN Ocean Conference, the second one. We thought that as we are within the world of foundations, philanthropic organizations, but also nature conservation organizations, that we should contribute to come up with a list of actions that we think need to be done in the next 10 years, so that if we want to avert this ocean crisis. And within these, I think within these actions, clearly there is a strong call, demand for a stronger global ocean governance. And within that, of course, for a robust BBNJ, High Seas Biodiversity Agreement. And there are also calls for more than that, because as many people said, we need to connect the oceans and climate, the economy and the environment. So we need probably a bigger global deal for the oceans. The UN Ocean Conference and SDG 14 progress is, like BBNJ, a very important mark of progress that needs to be achieved. It's almost a threshold that needs to be crossed. But we'll need to push for much more. And I think that, as John Kerry said not so long ago, we probably will need to consider a Paris Agreement for the oceans within this decade.
So thank you for that. Let me come to Atsushi if I can. And Atsushi, I'm just going to sort of throw that to you now. I mean, one of the questions that is raised is, do we need a more connected global governance of the ocean? Should there be a global Paris Agreement for the ocean, for example? That's John Kerry coming in there. And was that, and ironically, John Kerry, because of course at the moment, multilateralism is certainly off the US agenda. You know, in the sense that we have, and of course now we've just seen Shinzo Abe resign as a result of health problems, and certainly the problem for him, problem for us in the oceans, of course, was that he was a supporter of the high-level panel. Are we entering a period where actually this desire for, or the need for, greater and more coherent and holistic ocean governance, and perhaps even the mechanisms to support that, is actually going to be too difficult to do?
Thank you. Well, actually, I guess all my previous speakers mentioned that there's an importance of creating a platform of multi-stakeholders and more international collaboration centering around the creating sustainable ocean governance. And there should be a multilateral platforms, not only at the highest level of the government leadership, but also with the government, private sectors, multinational corporations, decade of ocean science. I mean, all these efforts has to come together at the end. And I think we are ready to discuss to create this sort of the multilateral stakeholder platform. And of course, Prime Minister Abe's one of his legacy is to let Japan into in participating in this high-level panel at the level. But also, I think before I leave, though, I just wanted to mention one other thing, which is the actually legacy also created by our First Lady, Akie Abe, who actually led to create a women's role or women's participation in the ocean governance and effort. And it was some of the things that she has initiated at some of the G20 discussions of bringing all the women leaders in the effort to create the kind of the environment for multilateral cooperation from a women's perspective, the role of women in creating this inclusiveness of ocean governance. And I think these are all these efforts has to be taken follow-up of all of us. And that's how we are getting ready for actually delayed, but for sure the next year is coming super year of ocean governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Atsushi. And we've got about 7 or 8 minutes left, and I want to do 2 things. One is I want to ask a question from the audience very briefly, and a very brief answer, almost like a poll question. Are we getting this right or not? The question is, COVID-19 has shaken the world economy, as all economies will attempt to invest hugely in economic building, which of course largely focuses on the recovery. Does this panel think it will cause a setback to environmental efforts? And I know, Peter, you're listening there. I'm going to go just to a couple of people. A brief answer, 2 or 3 people, a brief answer, if you will. Peter.
Okay, very briefly. Not an official position, but a personal position. I think we will see setbacks in the short term. But I think that people and governments are getting the message about the Malthusian effects, which will kick in if we continue on our track towards a 4 degrees world. And they will demand of government, and they will elect governments which are going to do something about it. The innovations, as I mentioned, are there. You can make plastic out of algae. You can get biofuel out of algae, as we heard at your last webinar. We can get all the power we need from offshore wind. And congratulations to Vietnam, what I heard in your webinar last week. You know, so the innovation is there. The solutions are there. So I do think long term, this will just be a temporary setback.
Now, can I just ask you briefly, temporary setback or more serious?
No, it shouldn't be that a step back, because we need to act on that. As I mentioned, the nature sent a bill to us. Nature sent a message to us, and it is us who needs to take on and needs to do things differently. It's an opportunity.
And I'm just going to come to one more, Tiago, because this is almost like a poll question in a way. Tiago, temporary setback, or is it going to be more serious, do you think?
Charles, no, I think that we are going to evolve into a transition in the economic model. I think that this is quite clear already in many sectors. In the energy renewable sector, mobility, we will have to bring those principles into the food sector, the transportation, the cities, the sewage systems. But I think that also the development of the concept of this natural capital as our last most precious resource of the planet will also change the dynamics of the economics. I think that nature will become part of the cost-benefit analysis of our orthodox economy, and that will allow for a game change that will probably save our species at the end of the day.
Well, thank you. Let me just come finally to one question that brings us back to the delayed processes that are going on globally around the ocean, as well as climate change. And that is this question around governance and the role of multilateralism in ocean governance. We've obviously got the BBNJ's process going on. There is a question, I think, around where many problems can't be resolved by single states or indeed by regions or by governments, and do need, I think, international cooperation. Where actually does the balance and the power lie in all of it? Is it really single states? Is it sort of economic blocs like the European Union? Is it implementing bodies like the FAO and ISA, or is it with industry? How are we going to understand the new architecture of governance that allows us to restore ocean health? Can I perhaps come to Rena for that, if I may, because you're looking both at the question of governance of high seas, but also probably have reflections on how governance potentially could be put together more broadly. Rena.
Thank you, Charlie. And I think, first of all, if there's one thing that the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us, it's that while we remain physically isolated from each other, now is not the time for us to retreat into ourselves. Now is the time to reach out and really collaborate with one another and to find innovative solutions to the challenges, unprecedented challenges that we're facing today. So it's more important than ever that we work together at all levels. And I don't think it's a question of whether it's a single state or a bloc of states or the United Nations or industry that will trump. I think it's at all levels, and that partly is the complexity of what other speakers refer to as the multi-stakeholder platform. But it also gives us hope that it can be done. At the national level, for example, within states, there can be better coordination amongst the different agencies, between federal governments and state governments, between the different agencies, because better national coordination can drive a greater international cooperation. And why do I say this? You look at the agencies that attend the IMO meetings or the FAO meetings or the CBD meetings, they all represent different agencies. If they can come together, it allows us to make more coordinated, more coherent decisions at the international level that we can then take back to implement nationally to create that collective effect that will bring a greater better outcomes in terms of how we protect the ocean and allow for sustainable use. And this is where many of the organizations, and certainly in our process also, we invite civil society. Our civil society participants in the process are not just environmental groups, they're also industry groups. They're all different advocates. And so really, it's just about bringing people together and allowing people a platform in which they can work together and they can collaborate together and they can share ideas and we can come to decisions collectively and then go implement them.
Thank you. I noticed, Rena, you subconsciously used the term Trump or the word Trump in the middle of that. I'm not sure how. Let's come finally, if I will, to Peter, just to reflect on that very issue. Multilateralism is clearly, of course, it's not dead, but it's struggling, isn't it? And how do we put these routes to solving these knotty ocean problems together from a governance point of view? Just very briefly, if you can, and I'll ask comment.
I don't think that multilateralism is on its way out at all. I mean, there's only one planet. It's just logical that we're going to have to govern ourselves in a global context. And remember that multilateralism is still functioning very effectively in lots of areas. And we're talking about illegal fisheries, FAO and the port states measures, that's the most effective weapon we've got. That's growing in implementation and in the numbers of countries signing up to it. I mentioned earlier about getting rid of harmful fishery subsidies. Well, I've met all the ambassadors in Geneva, and they're doing very positive work in the negotiating room right now, trying to get us by December. And that's China and America and everybody else around the table negotiating. So multilateralism is functioning, and great work, of course, that Rena does in the BB&J context, but it's functioning at so many levels. We're going through a bit of a rough time at the moment, but there's a big decision being made in a big country in November that will affect things in a very different way for multilateralism. But definitely logic demands that we talk to each other, that we learn to share better, and as I said, that we innovate better, because those are our great strengths. And why wouldn't we, in a time of crisis, do what is best for us? So I don't have any lack of faith or hope in that.
Well, thank you, Peter, for those positive words of hope, and in a way, nicely summarizes, I think, that pause that we're now having for reflection, and the thought that perhaps the need to think more cohesive, need to think more holistically around all of these problems, not just the ocean problems, but all of them, is going to be something that hopefully will come out of this pause as a positive. I do want to thank all of our fantastic speakers. Thank you so much to Tiago Pite Cunha, to Naoko Ishii, to Rena Lee, to Atsushi Tsunami. I'm sorry I didn't get you too much, Atsushi, but thank you very much. And of course to Olai Uludong from Palau, who had to leave us. And of course to Seiichi Eto, the Minister for Ocean Policy in Japan, and Ricardo Santos, the Minister for the Oceans in Minister of Maritime Affairs in Portugal, and last but not least, of course, Peter Thomson, the UN Secretary General's Special Envoy for the Ocean. Thank you too very much to the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the Nippon Foundation for supporting this series. We hope the audience has certainly benefited and benefited from and enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you again soon in our upcoming webinars. And remember, of course, soon, well, of course, we have our ocean coming up soon in Palau, but hopefully also our own World Ocean Summit and Expo in Lisbon in Portugal in early March next year. So with that, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.